Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter remarked to me earlier that she was really grateful to have this wonderful warm weather, and I thought she was crazy until I remembered that she's from the University of Toronto. Please welcome Stephanie Côté.
Okay, hi everyone. Yes, I'm Stephanie Côté from the University of Toronto, where right now it's, I don't know Fahrenheit either anyways, but in Celsius we're approaching freezing already, so I was really happy to be here and have it be nice and warm. So this afternoon I will be presenting a very small scale study that I conducted on the use of the future tense by intermediate second language learners of French and comparing the effects of verb regularity versus irregularity. So to start, I will briefly go over the constructions that exist in French for expressing future tense. Then we'll look at some of the research that's been done to date on future tense in second language French. Then I'll present my own study, so the research questions and hypotheses, participants, methodology, and we'll conclude with a discussion presentation of the results. So to start, to express future tense in French, we have three options, three constructions we can use. The first is called the simple future or futur simple. It takes a verbal root and then you add inflection marked for person or number right onto the end. So in the example here, j'irai au cinéma, I will go to the movies. We can also use what's called the periphrastic future or the futur proche. You take the present tense of the verb aller, meaning to go, and then you add an infinitive verb at the end. So the same sentence would be je vais aller au cinéma. I'm going to go to the movies. And lastly, we can also use the present tense so long as it's clear that we're referring to a future event rather than a present event. So typically you'd find a temporal adverb just to indicate that future reference. So the same sentence again, je vais au cinéma ce soir. I'm going to the movies tonight. So the three constructions, they express virtually the same semantic content. Traditional grammar would tell us that the futur simple is supposed to be reserved for more distant future events, whereas the periphrastic and present tense should reflect more immediate future events. In actuality, particularly in Canadian French, that's not really how L1 speakers use it. They just use the periphrastic future as the preferred construction. In most contexts, there's certain factors that influence, but for the most part, the periphrastic is the preferred construction. Another distinction we can make between the three constructions, the futur simple and the present tense are both what would be called synthetic constructions, meaning you have a bound morpheme that attaches to a root to express the various forms or conjugations, as opposed to the periphrastic future, which is an analytic construction, meaning you have multiple free morphemes and together they produce this meaning of the future. So what we know is that analytic constructions, so the periphrastic future, are cognitively simpler to use. So for example, in the acquisition of L1 French, children acquire periphrastic future before they acquire simple future. Another distinction that's important specifically for this study, because my participants were L1 English speakers, is that the last two, the periphrastic and the present tense constructions, have equivalent forms in English, whereas the simple future does not. So looking a little more closely at the simple future, we can distinguish between regular and irregular verbs. So regular verbs are those verbs whose root in the simple future is just simply their infinitive form, and then you add the conjugation right on the end. So for example, the verb meaning to speak, with the first person singular conjugation, je parlerai, I will speak, as opposed to irregular verbs whose root is not the infinitive form. In fact, sometimes it looks nothing like the infinitive form, as with the verb that we also saw on the previous slide, aller, meaning to go. The root is ir, and so you get j'irai for I will go. So to look a little bit at some of the research that's been done to date on future in second language French, just a few studies here. Firstly, Nadazi and colleagues from 2003. They were looking at French immersion high school students in Ontario. They wondered whether the fact that the simple future, it's the predominant construction that's taught in FSL classes, even though, as we saw, L1 speakers actually prefer the periphrastic future. In fact, the simple future is considered a much more formal variant, but this is the one that's emphasized in FSL classes. So the authors wondered whether this predominance might affect their learners' preference in expressing future. That was not the case, though. The students preferred the periphrastic future with 78% use, as opposed to 11% for each of simple future and present tense. And I've included here as well some data from Shanna Poplik's corpus study on L1 speakers, just to compare, so we see that the learners are overusing a little bit the periphrastic and the present tense, and they're underusing the simple future. Next, we have Howard. Two studies, but the same idea, just one was cross-sectional, one was longitudinal. These were university students in Ireland. They were high, intermediate, advanced speakers. The three groups of learners, they either completed 2 years of university French, 2 years plus a year abroad in France, or both of those plus they'd been back at university for another year. And so he found something a little different from Nadazdi et al. His learners preferred the simple future, and it was only after having extensive contact with native speakers that some, but not all, switched and preferred the periphrastic future. However, once being back in the university environment, a lot of them actually reverted back to their preference for simple future. And lastly, we have Ayoun from 2014. She was looking at written production. She had intermediate and advanced learners, as well as a group of L1 speakers as a control. And the advanced and the L1 speakers preferred the simple future. Remember, it's the formal variant, it's a written task, so that probably explains that. Whereas the intermediate learners used all three constructions more or less with equal frequency. Now, this wasn't the intent of her study, but she does mention a tendency, particularly for the intermediate learners, they would try to regularize the irregular verbs. So for example, they'd say things like ils envoyeront, which should be ils enverront. Envoyer is the infinitive form, so they're trying to use that regular rule. Same thing with je savoirai, which should be je saurai. And she also provides accuracy rates for a closed test that they completed. She doesn't give the specific errors that they made for the test, but the accuracy rates, again, especially with the intermediate learners, they were quite a bit lower with some of the irregular verbs. Even for the advanced learners, there were a couple of irregular verbs that were particularly problematic. So if we wanted to kind of summarize the research just from these few studies, it's maybe not entirely clear which is the preferred construction for L2 speakers. And lastly, even though none of the studies specifically looked at regular versus irregular verbs, it does seem that the irregular verbs are particularly problematic for L2 learners. So that brings me to my own study. I had two research questions. Technically there's three, but I collapsed two of them in the first one. So the first is, how do intermediate L2 learners express future tense in French, and do they have a preferred grammatical construction? So I've said that they will use all three. This is because they're university learners. I teach the curriculum that they learn, so I know that they've learned all three constructions in class. But I said that they would prefer the periphrastic construction for a few reasons. It's analytic, so it's simpler to use. It exists in their L1 in English, and it's the preferred construction in Canadian L1 French. The second question was, do learners use different constructions with regular and irregular verbs? So I was interested in this question because I wondered whether they might try to avoid using the simple future with irregular verbs, since using it means that you have to remember and then use an irregular root. So I predicted that they would use the simple future more frequently with regular than with irregular verbs. So as I said, just a small scale study, so 10 learners participated. They were recruited from intermediate level French courses. Most were L1 English. A couple of them had different L1s, but one actually said she felt more comfortable in English than in her own L1. The other was a mature student who'd lived in Canada for over 30 years, so I wasn't really concerned with having a couple of different L1s. They'd learned French in a formal classroom-based environment. So again, they should have learned all three constructions, and none of them had extensive amounts of time living in a French-speaking milieu. Okay. So, to elicit expressions of future tense, I used a sentence formation task. So on a computer screen, they'd see words or groups of words in a random order, and they were told that they had to use the elements they saw, rearrange them to create a grammatically correct and semantically plausible sentence while making certain changes. So for example, they had to conjugate the verb. Sometimes they'd have to add or change a determiner or a preposition as well. So the elements that they'd see, again, all in random order, would be either a third person singular subject pronoun or noun phrase, which would be our subject. Then an infinitive verb, 14 regular and 14 irregular verbs. Some other element, for example, a noun phrase or a prepositional phrase, an adjective, something that would be interpreted as the complement of the verb. And then lastly, a temporal adverb to indicate the future reference, or in the case of distractors, present or past tense reference. So for example, they might see these elements, l'étudiant demain un examen à avoir, and their possible responses could be demain l'étudiant aura un examen, va avoir ou a un examen. So results. Table 1 here just shows the results with regular and irregular across the 10 learners. The first very general observation in line with my first research question, they are using all 3 constructions as well as a few non-target-like constructions. Sticking with my first research question, I had predicted that they would prefer the periphrastic future, which was the case. It's their preferred construction with both regular and irregular verbs. As concerns my second research question, I had predicted that they would be more likely to use simple future with regular than with irregular verbs, which really isn't the case, maybe like a teeny tiny bit more, but it's pretty much with equal frequency that they're using it. One thing that they did do that I hadn't anticipated was they're overusing the present tense with irregular verbs. So that's something that I had not anticipated. Now, after they completed the sentence formation task, they also did just a conjugation test where I asked them to conjugate all of the regular and irregular verbs with simple future and with present tense. The point of the test was if I was trying to assume a potential avoidance strategy, you can't assume that they're avoiding something if they don't even know what the construction is. So it was just to make sure that they actually know what these constructions are. So this table just shows just the simple future, their scores with regular and irregular verbs, and then also how often they used the simple future during the sentence formation task. So with the exception of one learner here who said he kind of blanked, the instructions just said conjugate in simple future, and he said he couldn't remember which one was a simple future, but the other learners are capable of conjugating both regular and irregular verbs. The mean score with regular was slightly higher, but not by much. So basically, even the learners who virtually never use the simple future, they do know how to. So it's not that they're actively avoiding it so much as they just prefer the periphrastic construction. Again, either because it's simpler to use, being analytic, or because maybe they've developed a certain amount of sociolinguistic competence, they understand this is the construction I'm supposed to use in Canadian French. So the last table here, it just shows collapsed across both types of verbs, regular and irregular, and I've included the L1 data from that Poplack study just so we can compare. So they're using the simple future with the exact same frequency as our L1 speakers. The periphrastic future is actually slightly underused, although that's due to this overuse of present tense with certain irregular verbs. So basically what we can draw from this is that the two either preferred or overused in the case of the present constructions are the constructions that exist in their L1, and in the case of the periphrastic is also analytic and easier to use. So returning to my hypotheses, the first is confirmed. They use all of the constructions and they prefer the periphrastic future. Second is not, however, I had thought they would be more likely to use the simple future with regular than irregular verbs. That's not the case. Instead, they're, for some reason, overusing the present tense with certain irregular verbs. So conclusions that we can take from this, again, only 10 learners, so we can't really go all out, but we're using all of the constructions. They prefer the constructions that have equivalent forms in their L1, so that's the present tense and the periphrastic future. So this was also shown by Nadasti et al. With other Canadian learners. And they do overuse the present tense as compared to L1 speakers, particularly with irregular verbs. And I'm not entirely sure why this is. It may have just been the specific semantics of the sentences that were used, because sometimes it was something that unfortunately I didn't really think of until after the fact. There are certain verbs in certain sentences where it would just be bizarre to use the present tense, but in other ones it's totally acceptable. So it may have just been that they figured, well, it's okay in this sentence, so I'm going to use it. Because when I looked at the data, there really were a few verbs that almost all of the learners used present tense with, so it may have been those specific verbs. But I don't think it's a type of avoidance strategy, because if that were the case, why wouldn't they just use periphrastic? It's even easier than using present tense, right? So that's all I have for you this afternoon. Thanks very much. Yes.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I feel, and that's totally impressionistic, that there is the same development in the French, spoken in France. That I feel that the simple future is on the way out
Yeah.
in the periphrastic forms
Yes.
taking over.
Yeah.
And so it's not just in the Canadian.
No, it's not.
The question is why the development in that direction.
Yeah.
So it's not just the cognitive growth because it will have happened a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
Yeah, I
it's
don't.
really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
Compare,
Yeah.
you know, the two varieties.
Yeah. I know that it's true, it is happening in France as well. I think it's a little more exaggerated in Canadian French, and it may have something to do with the contact with English. Most French speakers in Canada are bilingual French and English. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
What are your future directions? Do you plan to try this same test orally?
It was actually oral that they did. The conjugation test was written, but the sentences that they saw, they produced orally. I don't know what my future directions are for now. Like this has nothing to do with my thesis, so I'm kind of busy with that. So maybe in a little while I'll come back to that because I'd like to see maybe potentially with slightly less proficient learners, maybe they would show different tendencies, like maybe they would be more likely to avoid the simple future, whereas these learners are maybe advanced enough that they already feel comfortable using the simple future. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think the complex studies have shown, and others have shown, that one of the places where the simple future is retained is in the presence of negation.
Yes.
None of your sentences had.
No, none of them were negated. No. Yes, that's true. Negated sentences, also sentences which use the formal pronoun vous, are more likely to use it, but yeah. Yep.
I was also wondering, in the sentences you had to construct,
Mhm.
you always had some kind of temporal adverb there?
Yes.
In case it was the future?
Yes.
Was it always demain, or did you have different?
No, some would be demain, next year, in 2017, next summer. Yeah, they were all varied. Yeah.
Because there's a public Turkdown study
Okay.
that also shows that the type of temporal reference,
mhm.
whether it's specific or non-specific,
Yeah.
has an effect, but also that there's a tendency when you have a temporal adverb at all to use the present tense
Yep.
more often.
Yep.
So I'm thinking that that would also be a reason why you get more present tense than you would find in the other tenses.
Yep.
Right? Just because you do have a temporal adverb at all.
Yeah.
I also wondered in terms of the idea of avoidance, I mean, did you get forms of the type you showed that
Mhm.
are,
Where
there
they're
should be irregular forms,
Yeah.
but they don't make them irregular?
not actually that often, like maybe a couple, but most of the non-target like would be that they actually just kind of rearranged the sentence so that they just would change the adverb so they could use it in the past tense instead. So yeah, that wasn't a very common thing that I saw.
Because I wonder whether the use of present tense could be a way of avoiding the irregular in the future.
Yes, I thought that as well. The only thing is that the same verbs are irregular in present tense. So they're more comfortable with the present tense, seeing as it's the first thing that they learn in an FSL class, but those verbs are irregular in both present and simple future, so.
But if you had some way of knowing, like on the conjugation test, whether they were capable of producing
Mhm.
the future, simple future form,
Mhm.
and then they don't do it in the production test, that might be worth knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Anything else? No? Okay. Thanks, everyone.